This week's episode of our show has been sponsored by Stibble's Codex of Companions, which is now available for pre-order at the Ghostfire Games online store.
Designed by our amazing friend Logan at Runesmith, this book is jam-packed full of crazy critters to add to your games.
Your characters can befriend these companions and follow them on their adventures. So for all of you that have a party that is notorious for building up a small menagerie of adorable followers, this is the perfect way to get some rules for that so that you can control the chaos that such creatures bring.
So you can add all of these fun and adorable little monsters to your adventuring party by pre-ordering the book using the links below.
Stibble's Codex is coming off the rails of a fantastically successful Kickstarter campaign and is now coming up for pre-order for its eventual delivery very soon.
So check out that pre-order in the description below. And now, onto this week's episode.
Greetings, my name is Monty Martin.
And I'm Kelly McLaughlin.
And we are the Dungeon Dudes. Welcome to our channel where we cover everything Dungeons & Dragons, including advice for players and guides for Dungeon Masters.
We upload new videos on Tuesdays and Thursdays, so please subscribe to our channel so that you never miss an episode.
Today, we're going to talk about avoiding those Bog Standard monsters that plague low-level play in so many Dungeons & Dragons campaigns. And by the Bog Standard, we mean bandits, orcs, goblins, skeletons, and all their associated necromancery leaders, hobgoblin warlords, packs of spiders, wolves, and rats, and all those things that are the staples of fantasy campaigns, but that after now spending about 20 plus years fighting them in video games and campaigns, we're kind of done.
There's nothing wrong with a nice goblin camp or a cave full of goblins that are led by a bugbear. We're all expecting it, and it can be a lot of fun, but sometimes it's also fun to think outside the box. And we think that there are several creatures out there that fill the same role, but that offer a little bit of a new dynamic, something that might intrigue your players, especially if you have a group that's been playing for a while and has killed their fair share of thousands of goblins. They might want to kill something different.
So with all of these monsters, these are ones that you can use in a nice little horde of minions, but also have a big juicy villain or leader behind them. And they really work well at low levels of play between 1st and 5th level, but they can scale up in some interesting ways and be long-term minions as well. There's a lot of cool stuff to discuss, so let's get rolling.
So to kick things off, one of the first little minion monsters that we want to give the spotlight to is Blights. And we're talking the Twig Blights, the Needle Blights, the Vine Blights. All of the Blights are invited to this party. They can be really outstanding and creepy creatures for a more nature-esque expedition at early levels.
These creatures are animated vines, twigs, and plant-like creatures that usually come to life when there is something discordant in nature, or when nature is trying to fight back against encroaching civilization. And they are the perfect minions for a circle of druids that might be at odds with the forces of civilization or might have gone mad. This dual use of blights that I've used in my campaigns of both as a sign that something is wrong in nature or a force of nature that is fighting back against civilization are both really cool themes to explore at low levels of D&D play.
If we're talking about locations that are quite standard for early levels D&D, you have your forests, you have your swamps, you have your jungles. These are all pretty typical early level or even later level locations. And filling these locations with blights instead of goblins or skeletons tells a much more interesting story, and they feel at home in these locations. So it's worth considering if you're setting out for a nature campaign.
And especially when you have your plucky band of adventurers starting out in a low-level village, blights plaguing the countryside, the forests, the orchards, the farm fields works in basically the same way as skeletons or goblins plaguing that exact same village. It's just that now you can have an interesting fae or druidic or nature-based force that is controlling that, as opposed to, here's your hobgoblin warlord.
These creatures also have some really unique abilities, like being able to blend in with their natural surroundings or being able to have ranged attacks or entangling effects. So they can really stand out and pose a unique threat to an early party that shows what D&D has to offer without absolutely destroying them like some of the harder monsters will, but still showcasing that interesting package that creatures like this can have.
In a similar manner that things can go wrong in nature, the elements as well can often bleed into the mortal world in various ways, whether by appearing through planar rifts and caused by elemental chaos, or by being summoned by an insane wizard to carry out some task. This is where Mephits make for one of my favorite low-level mischievous elemental foes, and I've used them in a variety of ways in my campaigns. Not only are these flying elemental-based creatures packed with all sorts of fun abilities to use in combat, they come with their own themes, whether that is magma, mud, ice, or fire, and you can combine them in a variety of ways, either having a group of magma-based Mephits all working together, or combine the elements together into a bit of elemental chaos of your own.
These are the perfect low-level monsters to throw into a campaign that is going to progress to elemental extremes, exploring elemental environments, dealing with elemental gods and monsters. Mephits are the great start to that setting. And my favorite thing about Mephits that no player sees coming unless they've encountered them before is their explosions. And this is kind of their key ability, is they're pretty easy to kill. They're low-level monsters. But often when you kill a Mephit, they explode in a glory of elemental insanity that can damage all the creatures around them. It can be a really dangerous encounter, but not one that is impossible to overcome, and again, poses that threat of what these sort of elemental creatures can do, but still at a low level of play.
Mephits are also a low-level flying enemy, which can make an excellent challenge for low-level parties who aren't really expecting to have to face a large group of airborne enemies. It makes a really unique challenge. Furthermore, Mephits are reasonably intelligent and can speak languages, and oftentimes I just use the exact same funny goblin voice that I use with goblins with Mephits, and it works basically perfectly. You can essentially treat Mephits with that same role-playing angle that you role-play a goblin. They can be greedy, they can be tricksy, they can even be fun-loving and be creatures that your characters can befriend and ally with. So you can use all those role-playing techniques that you're used to using with a goblin and apply them directly to a Mephit, and now you have a crazy elemental flying enemy that is way cooler than goblins.
When you're designing your campaign, you can also think of Mephits for the fact that they are elemental, and they could be summoned creatures from a mad wizard who is just conjuring them up the same way they would other elementals or other beings.
Yeah, it works just like a necromancer. You've always got the necromancer raising up skeletons to harass the village. Well, now you've got an insane conjurer who is summoning up a bunch of elemental creatures. And much in the same way that undead kind of evolve, elemental creatures can evolve as well by having that same mad mage summoning up gargoyles, azers, or larger elemental creatures in the same way that a necromancer might pack along a flesh golem or ghosts or banshees or tougher undead creatures.
When the planes of Dungeons & Dragons are thrown into chaos, occasionally the plane of order comes into play and stomps its foot down by sending out Modrons. These little creatures are defined by their adorable artwork, and they are bound by logic and math, which can make them really fun to roleplay and really a wacky interpretation of low-level creatures at the table.
My Modrons, when I roleplay them, speak binary, so they always communicate in strings of zeros and ones, and it has always been a delightful way to roleplay Modrons who, despite being creatures of order, actually embody a lot of chaos. There's a famous module called the Great Modron March that encapsulates this idea that once every several hundred years, the Modrons come out of the plane of Mechanicus and march across the planes in almost this crazy display that no one quite understands. And I love the idea that Modrons embody that sometimes law can become so Byzantine and confusing that it is basically chaos.
If you are designing a campaign that is going to build itself up to plane hopping and there's a lot of danger involving portals through the planes and creatures coming in, Modrons might be the perfect answer to the low-level option for experiencing these plane hopping creatures.
Modrons also are just fun in combat. There's a variety of them that levels up, that you got your basic flying, shooting Modrons, the wonderful pentadrones, the tridrones. They're such delightful little creatures, and WizKids has actually put out a bunch of really cute Modron miniatures recently. The artwork for... I honestly, the biggest appeal of the Modrons is that they're just so damn cute.
I have a hard time killing them. Whenever I see them, I want to befriend them because they're so great and so lovable.
Yeah, but they kind of embody that kind of machinery gone haywire sort of thing, and I love using that in that way, like where ultimately they're part of like this big hive mind, and maybe you've got a rogue Modron or a rogue pack of Modrons. Or I really like this idea that I've used in several of my campaigns, where because Modrons have such a strict hierarchy, if the pentadrone that is controlling a group of monodrones and duodrones and tridrones and quadrones, if that pentadrone has been destroyed, all the lesser Modrons that it was controlling basically all go haywire. And so you either have to repair the pentadrone or destroy the Modrons. And it can create really interesting scenarios when you use that hierarchy as an instigator of chaos.
Speaking of plane hopping, let's jump into the Fae. There are a lot of great low-level creatures that are abundant in the Fae and could be leaking out into the worlds of your D&D campaign. We're talking about things like Sprites, Pixies, and Quicklings.
Now, one of the things that I always come back to time and time again with goblins is that goblins in Dungeons & Dragons have become a fantasy race. But in so much of the folklore origins of goblins, they're basically fairies. And I feel that the modern D&D goblin is something completely different from its origins as this kind of demonic trickster that comes from a fairy realm. And so why not just go right to start using fairies in that exact way? Not every pixie sprite has to be a benevolent or helpful creature. Sometimes the Fae can be capricious and mad. They can be tricksters. They can even serve evil masters, like the Queen of Chaos or the Winter Queen, and be sent into the mortal world to disrupt mortals in awful ways.
I think the depiction of evil pixies and fairies is actually a really great thing to use that isn't used often enough. We have this sort of Disney-esque version of pixies and fairies that we see with like Tinkerbell from Peter Pan, but if you look back at the original lore surrounding these sort of Fae elements, they were all mischievous, evil, and maniacal in a lot of their applications. And I think if we dive into that sort of lore, it can be a really interesting, unique, and intimidating threat for a group of players. And a great sort of boss monster for this might be a coven of hags who has summoned up these Fae creatures to protect their little coven and their little home where they are performing their rituals and magic.
One of the things that I also love about Fae creatures is that they remind us that logic is such a human thing. The creatures that inhabit the worlds like William Shakespeare's A Midsummer Night's Dream are not creatures of logic. They are creatures of expression and emotion. And while the fairy world has rules, those rules don't follow or track in the logical ways that humans think they do. And I'm a big fan of this because so often I find that player characters love to rationalize. They love to figure out, okay, what are the true motivations? Like, why would you do that? That's not logical. Fairies get to do things that aren't logical. They get to do things that don't make sense. They think that a walnut is a valuable artifact for what it is as a walnut, not because it has any intrinsic value as money. And they think that the human passions of drives of things like money and love are just toys that they can play with to trick humans into doing foolish things that make them cry. So this sort of alien psychology that embodies the Fae is something that can make them antagonists without making them necessarily evil.
Last on our list, we are looking at a monster that was introduced in Mordenkainen's Tome of Foes, and this is the Kruthik. Now, the Kruthik is kind of an insectoid, burrowing monster that can pop up in any number of locations in your campaign. And if you have this sort of idea of going into this kind of gross insectoid kind of horror campaign, they might be a great choice. You kind of get a little bit of Starship Troopers going on with these.
Oh, there's so many great things that you can draw on that are often associated with science fiction, but that the Kruthiks are a great blend of fantasy and science fiction in the world of Dungeons and Dragons. And especially if you like extraplanar entities and things like the Far Realm as well, the Kruthiks don't have to come from the mortal world. They don't have to come from the material plane. They could come from another planet on the material plane and be this insidious burrowing force. Or they could even be just part of another part of the world that like kind of represent that whole thing where you have an invasive species that is supposed to be in one ecology that gets moved into another. And so maybe there's just a merchant traveler that accidentally brought a few Kruthiks as a curiosity from the far lands on the other continent. And now a Hive Lord has gotten out and is burrowing underneath the capital. And you have to figure out, okay, well, do we destroy these things or do we try to rescue them from what's happened? They're not supposed to be here.
The lore for the Kruthiks defines them as reptilian, but I actually like to compare them more closely with something like ants. Ants which show up and ruin your picnic or show up in your house or your driveway, and you just find these anthills with tens to 20s of ants, and then below the surface are thousands. And disrupting the anthill causes this explosion of ants to come out, and it can be a really interesting way to make an early campaign adventure for your characters.
The tunneling nature of Kruthiks means that you can actually draw on all your playbook from kobolds. And maybe the Kruthiks are actually pretty intelligent, and where kobolds might do things like create pit traps and spike traps or glue traps, the Kruthiks might create pits of acid. They might even have bone spurs, or you could really go super like StarCraft, Zerg style and Starship Troopers style, and they make these burrows of like organic flesh with eggs everywhere that explode, and like the pools of acid and the spraying stuff. So you can actually build a dungeon that has these mechanical features to it that you would normally associate with a constructed environment that has like things like acid sprays and poison sprays and explosions and doors that are like sealed with like this organic stuff that you need to find like the pheromone sac to open the organic door. And so you would have this opportunity to build a totally organic dungeon. Again, you're using your standard playbook that you're just doing the same thing that you're doing with kobolds, and now you're just doing it with Kruthiks. In fact, even what you could do is you could homebrew that Kruthik Hive Lord to take some abilities out of the playbook of a dragon and make it like this big, winged, like super Kruthik Lord with a giant acid breath, and just use the stats for a black dragon.
Make a Kruthik's queen that is laying the eggs, and that's the problem they have to solve.
Yeah.
And there you have a great adventure.
Yeah, and it could be the seeds of a wider campaign. Where are these creatures coming from? Maybe there is some force. Maybe the Mind Flayers are planting the Kruthiks in the world to slowly erode the defenses of the population so that they can take over from something else. So there's lots of plot hooks and seeds that you can instigate here.
Now, by and large, there's no issue with using the bog standard options, the goblins, the skeletons, and the like of that sort. There's a lot of implications for why these creatures are staples of Dungeons & Dragons. But we have found that there are some that just aren't getting the spotlight that they deserve, even though they can fill the same role and have implications for varying types of campaign settings. So when you're designing a campaign or your homebrew world or trying to figure out the trigger that sets off the adventure, think of these other monsters as possible candidates for how to imply the larger world of the adventure you're trying to tell.
Also, I've been playing with a lot of new players who are getting into D&D and these hobbies for the very first time. And for many of these players, there's a real big issue with the idea of killing humans. And that was what started me down the path of thinking, like, an elemental creature or a blight or a Kruthik is not fighting and killing a human person. It's a force of nature, a force of the elements, something that might not always be able to be reasoned with. And so for some of the new players that I was introducing to the game that are not necessarily familiar with these fantasy tropes and are interested in tabletop role-playing games and the fantasy of D&D, but don't want to murder humans, turning to these creatures was actually a really eye-opening experience, and it got me thinking more and more about how I could build D&D campaigns that explored interesting creatures and interesting monsters that didn't necessarily come with that moral baggage of, isn't this an intelligent person with, like, feelings?
So this has been a look at 5 low-level monsters that avoid the Bog Standard in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. Tell us about your favorite low-level minion monsters in the comments below.
This video was originally titled Avoiding Bandits, Orcs, Goblins, and Skeletons. And a big thank you to our patron Gav, who pointed out that that basically was an acronym for BOGS, or the Bog Standard. Our patrons are an amazing part of our channel and our Discord community, which is available exclusively to our patrons as well. A big thank you to every single one of our patrons for making the work that we do here on YouTube possible. If you enjoy what we do, please consider joining our community by following the links in the description below.
Also, our live play Dungeons of Drakkenheim is coming to Kickstarter. We've partnered with Ghostfire Games to bring this campaign to life as a 5th edition module. You can follow the links below to join the mailing list to be up to date on all the information regarding this Kickstarter. You can also check out our live play in the Worlds of Drakkenheim, which airs Tuesday nights at 6 p.m. Eastern on Twitch. You can find all the previous episodes of those shows right up over here.
And we have plenty more videos looking at the monsters that inhabit the worlds of Dungeons & Dragons right up over here.
Please subscribe to our channel so that you never miss an episode.
Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you next time
in the dungeon.